Tasmania sells itself on a specific set of images. The pink granite and white sand of the Bay of Fires. Wineglass Bay curving under the hazards at Freycinet. The dolerite towers of Cradle Mountain mirrored in a still lake at dawn. Convict history at Port Arthur, art at Mona, Saturday morning crowds at Salamanca Market. It is one of the most photographed small islands on Earth, and the photographs are earned. That is the front of the brochure. This video is about the back of it. A tin town whose main street was anchored by a working slaughterhouse. A hydro village where daffodils still line paths to front doors that no longer exist. A copper town of 900 people that poisoned its own water and buried most of itself. And stay until the end, because number 1 is a town you can only reach with diving gear. The one that stayed with us longest. This channel goes looking for the places the travel guides leave out, so subscribe because we find them every week. Today we are counting down 15 Tasmanian ghost towns so forgotten you will not find them on Google Maps. Start in the northeast, on the cold, wet Blue Tier Plateau in a tin town called Lottah. At its peak it held about 500 people, 2 hotels, a school, a bakery, and somehow fielded a full 18-man Australian rules football team. It also had a slaughterhouse in the middle of the main street, which is how one visitor came to call it the dirtiest town in Tasmania. The tin ran thin, the people drifted off, and the old ore-crushing battery still stands in the regrowth. A town remembered mostly for how it smelled. A short drive from Zeehan on the west coast sits Dundas. Its post office ran from 1890 to 1930, and it had its own newspaper, the Zeehan and Dundas Herald. It was also rich enough in strange rock that a mineral found nearby was named after it, Dundasite, a word now filed permanently in mineralogical catalogs. The town proved less durable. The ore thinned, the forest took the streets, and today the site is buried down unmarked dirt roads that visitors still get lost trying to follow. The mineral is easier to find than the town it was named for. Further along the Blue Tier there is a wide open field marked with a few interpretive signs. In the late 1870s this was Poimena, a tin town with a school, shops, and a prominent hotel. A large share of its people were Chinese miners, close to 1,000 worked across the wider district, and they planted cottage gardens to soften a bleak windswept plateau. When the accessible tin gave out, everyone left and the timber buildings vanished completely. The gardens did not. The foxgloves those miners planted naturalized and kept reseeding, and more than a century later they still bloom every summer over ground where houses once stood. The town is gone. Its flowers keep coming back for another season. On the Murchison Highway near Rosebery, you can still drive underneath a length of rusting aerial cable strung overhead like a forgotten telegraph line. That cable is most of what remains of Williamsford. It was never big, around 100 people, clinging to a steep, wet mountainside to feed the mines high on Mount Red. Its answer to that vertical country was a haulage system called Hercules, which climbed more than 500 meters and ran over 1.5 kilometers from town to mine. When Rosebery modernized, Hercules was shut down in 1986 and the town emptied. The hardware was too big and too remote to bother removing, so it simply stayed. A lone plaque marks the pioneers. The Ropeway marks everything else, one slow creek at a time. Waddamana is an Aboriginal word meaning noisy water, which suited the place because this was the site of Tasmania's first state hydroelectric power station. From about 1910, workers harnessed the Great Lake and the Shannon River to send power all the way to Hobart, and a whole village grew up around the turbines in the remote Central Highlands. The last of its power stations was decommissioned in 1994, and the reason for the village evaporated with it. Families left, houses were removed. But the ornamental bulbs they had planted kept coming up. Every spring, daffodils still bloom along paths that lead to front doorsteps of houses that no longer exist. The power station is a museum now. The gardens never got the memo. A town of 2,000 people does not usually vanish quietly, and Gormanston did not. It sat above the copper mines near Queenstown on hills stripped so bare by mining and smelter fumes that they still look lunar. In October 1912, a fire in the Mount Lyell mine below killed 42 men and trapped 100 more until it was put out, one of the worst mining disasters in Australian history. The town never fully recovered. People drifted away for decades. Then, in 1951, cyclone-force winds tore through and destroyed the school, the fire station, and many of the homes that were left. Gormanston was hit from two directions: fire from under the ground, then wind from over it. A small community still holds on up there, on the bare hills, watching the weather. 1 kilometer downhill from Gormanston, a single building still stands: the roofless shell of the Royal Hotel, abandoned in the 1950s. Everything else that was the town of Linda is gone. In its day, it supported the North Mount Lyell mine and carried a hard reputation, rough enough that a brawl between Italian immigrants and local Britishers once ended with a man fatally stabbed. When the mine changed hands in 1903, people began moving uphill to Gormanston, and Linda slowly emptied. Buildings were pulled down or rotted away until only the hotel was left, too far gone to use, too stubborn to fall. Not long ago, a film crew flew a drone over the ruin, and the town's single remaining resident watched them warily from the cafe next door. 1 hotel, 1 witness, and a valley that used to be a town. When the mine at Rossarden closed, the company tried to sell workers their own houses for $1. Few took the offer. Rossarden sat in a valley under the dolerite cliffs of Ben Lomond and lived entirely off the Aberfoyle mine, once the biggest tin mine in Tasmania, employing around 230 men at its 1950s peak. Falling tin prices gutted it through the 1970s. A last modernization lasted barely 10 months before the mine shut in February 1982. Within a few months, the population fell from about 500 to 90. Unsold houses were demolished and carted away, and the whole settlement was put up for auction. Then, oddly, in 1993, around 400 abandoned car bodies were dragged out of the surrounding bush and crushed. The people left on their own. The cars apparently needed help. If you are enjoying the parts of Tasmania that never made the travel brochure, give the video a thumbs up. And drop a comment. Have you ever stumbled onto a place like this on some back road miles from where you meant to be? From here on, the tone starts to turn. For a while in the 1890s, Mathinna was the 3rd largest town in Tasmania. Gold did that. The new Golden Gate here was one of the state's biggest gold mines, pulling roughly 260,000 ounces, about 8 tons, out of the northeast hills. Then something happened that the town never shook. In June 1913, a prospector named William Mullins walked out to check his possum traps and did not come back. 2 weeks later, his body was found on a wooden funeral pyre. Not dumped, but arranged and set alight. The killer was never identified. With the gold already fading and that shadow over the place, people drifted away, and the 3rd largest town in the state shrank to a few hundred. The name Mathinna, as it happens, belonged first to an Aboriginal girl adopted and then abandoned by a governor's family. The town wore a borrowed name and an unsolved death. To reach Corinna from the south, you drive your car onto a cable-hauled barge and pull across the Poimena River, the last vehicle ferry of its kind in Tasmania, on a river named after a convict who ate his fellow escapees. It is a strange approach to what was once a gold rush town of about 2,500 people. Founded in 1881, Corinna had pubs on both banks and one lasting claim. The largest gold nugget ever found in Tasmania, roughly 7.5 kilograms, came out of this ground. The easy gold ran out within a few decades and the rainforest closed in. What survives is a restored wilderness village on the edge of the Tarkine. No fuel, no Wi-Fi, and the oldest working Huon Pine river cruiser in the world tied up at the dock. It is a ghost town you can book a bed in. And after everyone else had gone, one man stayed for 18 years. His name was Tim Adams, and until 2009 he lived alone in the abandoned hydro village of Lake Margaret, high on Mount Sedgwick above Queenstown, keeping a century-old wooden pipeline in working order by himself. The village was built between 1911 and 1914 by the Mount Lyell Company to power its copper smelters, in what happens to be the wettest town in Tasmania, the highest annual rainfall of any settlement in the state. As the operation automated, the cottages emptied one by one until the population was exactly 1. He tended the King Billy Pine pipeline until it finally wore out around 2006 and the scheme closed for a rebuild, and then he left too. The power station still runs and you can tour it, but consider the arithmetic of it. A whole village, and for 18 years its entire population was a single man and a wooden pipe. In 1925, thousands of people walked 42 kilometers through mud into roadless country west of Hobart to dig for a metal most of them had never heard of. It was called osmiridium, a rare, extremely hard alloy, and at the height of the rush it was worth several times the price of gold. Its main commercial use was tipping the nibs of fountain pens. More than 1,000 mining permits were issued in a single quarter of 1925, and a town appeared where there had been nothing. A school, a community hall, a post office, a bakery, a butcher, police quarters, a field hospital, reachable only on foot or by pack horse. Tasmania became one of the world's largest sources of osmium and iridium, and about half of the state's supply came out of this one field. Then oversupply crashed the price, and the ballpoint pen quietly killed the market for pen nibs. Mining dwindled through the 1930s, all but stopped during the war, and the last permanent resident left in 1960. 1,000 people crossed a wilderness for a metal that tipped fountain pens, and a cheaper pen ended it. Balfour, more or less, killed itself. It was a copper town of about 900 people, built between 1908 and 1912, deep in the Tarkine rainforest of the far northwest, on the dream that it would become a second Mount Lyell. It was so isolated that headstones had to be hauled in by horse-drawn tram from the coast. It also had no resident doctor and primitive sanitation, which is how sewage seeped into the drinking water and typhoid tore through the population. Among the dead was a 15-year-old named Sylvia MacArthur, the daughter of a mine engine driver who had spent 1912 writing cheerful letters about daily life in Balfour to a Launceston newspaper's children's page. She wrote about school concerts and the weather. Then she stopped. Here is the detail that stops people cold. Her simple grave slab lies on the hillside beside the granite headstone of the mine manager, William Murray, who shot himself the day before she died as the finances collapsed. Around 400 people are buried in that cemetery. 4 marked graves remain. The rest have gone back to the forest, along with nearly everything else. There is a port town on Macquarie Harbor you can now reach only 2 ways: a boat across the water, or a 7-kilometer walk along an abandoned railway through Rainforest. At its peak, around 1900, Pillinger held close to 1,000 people across 2 settlements, 3 wharves, a sawmill, brickworks, hotels, stores, a police station, and a Catholic church. East Pillinger alone had 80 dwellings and 25 businesses in 1902. It was built as the ocean gateway for James Crotty's copper empire, and for a brief moment it was almost grand. Passengers rode between Pillinger and the mines in imported English railway carriages with reversible seats and polished brass fittings. Then the rival Mount Lyell Company chose Strahan as its port instead. The rail line was pulled up, the town's purpose evaporated, and families left one by one until the last of them, the Crossons, walked out in 1943. The brass fittings are long gone. The brick kilns, 3 giant boilers, and a 240-meter wharf are still out there in the wet forest, waiting for the next person to walk in. Stand on the shore of Lake Burbury and there is not much to hear. Wind moving across open water, mist sliding down off the West Coast Range, Mount Jukes, Mount Huxley, and settling over the far side. Dark, tannin-stained water, sharp gray stumps, scarlet rocks along the edge. It looks like wilderness that has never held anything at all. It is not. Under that water, under as much as 50 meters of it, is a town. Its name was Crotty. It was gazetted in 1900 on the bank of the King River, a copper-smelting town named after the Irish prospector who built the operation. By 1902, it had over 150 houses, around 700 people, and 3 hotels. The smelters failed almost from the start. After a corporate takeover in 1903, the town slowly emptied, and by the late 1920s, the last residents had gone. That should have been the end of it, an ordinary abandoned mining site. The real end came 60 years later, and from above. In 1991, the Hydroelectric Commission finished the Crotty Dam, and the rising waters of the new Lake Burbury closed over the entire town site. Foundations, railway, the old steel bridge, all of it. The maps never quite caught up. Official Tasmanian topographic sheets still mark the proclaimed town of Crotty, a town you would now need diving gear to visit. And every so often, in a hard drought, the lake drops, as it did in 2016, and the dead streets come briefly back into the light before the water takes them again. You will not find Crotty on Google Maps. You will find a lake. The town is still down there, keeping its own weather, waiting for the next dry year. The brochure is not wrong about Tasmania. It just leaves a lot out. Of all of them, Crotty is the one that stayed with us, a town you can only reach by draining a lake. Which of these surprised you most, and is there a ghost town near you we should find next? Subscribe, and we will keep bringing back the places the travel guide skipped.